I know you're new in town. Carl, the innkeep. I don't mean to interrupt. I hope you're enjoying your dinner. But I've heard that you guys are looking for coin. So you see, I got dry storage back there, and for the past couple nights, every time I go in, I'm missing stuff. Mostly food, honestly, primarily cheese, but not only that. And sometimes it's small bags of grain or holes in my corn pouches. I don't know what it is exactly. I've seen some rat tracks, which obviously leads me to believe that it might be rats, but vermin have been in these parts for ages and it's never been this bad. I did see some tracks that head out back into the woods, but I don't think I'm well enough equipped to go deal with it. Plus, it's not like I can shut the store down. If you'd follow the tracks and see what's up, I'd appreciate it. I'd even reward you if I can. Hi, I'm Trevor. I post D&D videos every week on Wednesdays, and this is a second side quest on the channel. This series is specifically to give you ideas for either one-shots or adventures that you can drop into a campaign that might not be directly related to your main quest that the PCs are going on. I have the PDF of this entire side quest in the description, and it's called Rat Tracks. This game actually came sort of naturally, weirdly enough, from a 5e game that I played with my party. I think it was in our first game of 5e ever. And as a novice DM, my party was moving from one location to another, and I was, at least I thought I was, just explaining or kind of giving flavor for their travel. So I was describing the sounds that they heard and the smells that they could smell and the weather. And I said that along the road they saw, like as they were looking at the ground, they saw tiny rat tracks off into, like kind of off the beaten path. And my players, which makes sense looking back, saw this as a plot hook. They're like, oh, rat tracks? Like this is cool. So they followed the rat tracks. What resulted was me having to improv an entire dungeon based on this rat track plot hook that I didn't have planned. So it was all improvised, and it taught me a lot about D&D in that game because I learned how much fun it can be to have this kind of off-the-cuff style adventure. I don't have the exact notes from that game to provide, so I kind of rewrote it or recreated it, and that's what I've attached in the description of this video. Rather than reading a PDF to you, which I think would be painfully boring, I'm going to show you the map and talk about some of the highlights and also talk about how you could adjust this, because I'm a homebrew DM, and when I find things and borrow them from the internet, I kind of do it in the spirit of a homebrew DM. So I tweak and modify and alter and things like that. And I want that to be kind of crystal clear when it comes to how to use this game. You can steal any individual part of this or the whole one shot, and you can also scale it up. This specific side quest is designed for a levels 3 to 5 party of 3 to 4 players. So this is the map. This is at its core a 5-room dungeon. And this map, along with the full write-up, like I said, are in the PDF in the description. Before I get into the specifics of the map, I do want to talk about the kind of mini-boss of this dungeon, which is something that I refer to as a rat piper. I designed the rat piper as an action-oriented monster, and I will include a link to Matt Colville's action-oriented monsters in the description. I'll talk about why I did that when I get to that room, but it's essentially a spin off of a warlock in this case. And I thought that that was important to bring up because the first room in this dungeon is like an abandoned cabin or small home. And depending on how you play this, that could be the home of the warlock, or it could be just a empty home that was taken over by this rat pipe. So room 1 is fairly straightforward. There's a front door to get into this home. There's a secret back door, and in my head, that's where the rat tracks lead. Maybe there's a hole, like a rat-sized hole in the back of the door. You can flavor that however you want. The room that kind of juts off to the side, you can have that be an outhouse or a kitchen or whatever. I mean, I intentionally left this kind of open so you could decide how you decorated the room. It also depends if this is actually an abandoned room or an abandoned home, or if there was someone living here who's since moved underground, right? So from room 1 to room 2, there's hallway A. Hallway A is the kind of entrance into the dungeon part of the dungeon. It's a small, narrow, winding corridor. You could even use this as the first location for a combat encounter. And I think it would be a great place to introduce swarms of rats, because that would, I think, further increase how tight and cramped this area felt. If your party has already been adventuring, or Or if they're a lower level party, maybe you don't want to introduce combat this early, and that's perfectly fine. All of this is completely optional. So room 2 is a large stone room that is unlit, except for light that is kind of coming out of room 3, which I'll get to in a bit. There are mounds of rat nests peppered throughout the room, and depending on the level and size of your party, you might increase or decrease the number of these nests that are there. In the module description, I included options for items that could be found inside of these rat nests, including a key that would open the gate to room 3. That's completely optional, it depends on your party. This is also a good time for them to actually get into combat with some giant rats. And depending on the size of the party, you would adjust the number of giant rats that they would fight. Not every nest needs to be automatically a combat encounter. As a matter of fact, I think it might increase tension if the first 1 or 2 nests that they search through just have some items or some kind of scraps of paper and trash and things like that. Room 3 is separated from room 2 with a wrought iron gate. In room 3, there's a desk in one corner and some skeletons piled up in the other corner. At the desk, there could either be an NPC who is in very rough shape, maybe passed out at the desk, or it could be a corpse of an NPC that is not quite a skeleton, but on their way. It depends on how you want this to work for your game. My thought was, if this was a living NPC, then maybe this was the scorned lover of the warlock that is the boss of this dungeon. Or it could have been another adventurer who came and was trying to conquer this warlock piper. Regardless, I think it adds some roleplay elements to an otherwise strictly combat encounter, and my players tend to like that kind of stuff. In order to avoid mismatching the balance of the combat, I would tend to have this person be in such rough shape that if they are alive and they get saved, they end up either waiting for the party to kill the piper or they flee in order to get themselves back up to health. Now, let's say you have a healer in your party. If you want to if they choose to heal this person, maybe they could. You could use the sidekick rules from Tasha's. Maybe they could fight alongside. But that is not on kind of the top of my priority list. And it might just be because in every D&D game I've ever run, I basically never have a dedicated healer. Don't know why my players are that way, but it seems to always happen. So that's room 3. And then there's the hallway between room 2 and room 4, which is hallway B, is the first room where I would introduce a technical trap. And there are options for this as well. So in my head, the most obvious trap or the most simplistic trap would be a pit trap, kind of where the B is on the map. And this pit trap either could not trigger from the rats themselves because they're not as heavy as a medium or even small sized creature, or along the sides of the stonework, there could be enough room for the rats to walk, but not enough room for a smaller medium-sized creature to walk. So the pit could actually just be in the middle of that square. Regardless, the rules for how I would operate that trap are in the description. And you could even change it up. If you don't want it to be a pit trap, you could have it be like a portcullis that drops and separates the party. Kind of took that a little bit from Matt Colville's video that's similar to this. I think it's called the Delian Tomb, where he talks about a goblin adventure. I'll link that video in the description as well. All of Matt Colville's videos really inspired me to start homebrewing and running D&D and creating this YouTube channel. Room 4 is where the rat piper is. This is the like the big bad boss room, if you want to call it that. And there's a raised platform with a throne on it. And depending on the kind of tenor of your game, that throne might be made out of bones and like cobbled together like remains, which is really gruesome. Alternatively, if you want something a little bit more comedic and lighthearted, it could be made of like cheese or like things that they've stolen aren't quite as gross as, bones. So now I'm going to switch to the stat block for the rat piper before I describe how to wrap up this dungeon. So here's a description of the rat piper. They're a warlock, and I really want to focus on what they can do in battle. They have Eldritch Blast, and they have a quarterstaff. Generally, they would favor using Eldritch Blast rather than getting up close and using the quarterstaff. Then, as a bonus action, they can quote-unquote play the pipe. They have a actual pipe that they can play, which would make a giant rat enter the combat. As the DM, you would obviously get to pick how often you would want this to happen. So as a reaction, they can do something called Vermin Step. This is kind of a play off of Misty Step, but instead of it just being a general reaction, when they get hit by a melee attack, the piper is able to teleport 15 feet to an unoccupied space they can see, and they leave a swarm of rats behind. Again, you can decide If they take a lot of damage, maybe they don't leave the rats behind, or they leave the corpse of a rat behind. It solely depends on how powerful your party is. Very often, when I end up creating homebrew monsters, I'm adjusting them as the pace of the battle is going. And although some people might scoff at that and say that I could like plan better or whatever, I want the game itself to feel as fun as possible. And that's what matters to me over anything else. So I could plan forever, but if my players come up with something really cool and really impactful, I want that to matter. And I want the game to feel like, I don't know, realistic's not the right word for it, but it's so hard, it's so easy to get caught up in my own head and plan something out and then realize in execution, like, okay, those numbers are all off, or I need to tweak this, I need to move this around. So you have to feel comfortable in doing that stuff on the fly. As their villain actions, which occur at the end of any player's turn during the listed round, so any of the PC's turns during the listed rounds, they would have 3, because that's normally how long combat works, and that's also what was recommended in Colville's video. The first one is Welcome to the Nest. So the Piper plays a shrill note on their flute, and a swarm of rats create a wall that start to encapsulate the party. You can choose if it creates a wall that closes in or just a wall that blocks off the door. But I think something that affects the actual terrain of the battle really amps up the tension of the game. And then during the second round, they might shout swarm, and all of the rats can move. They wouldn't get an attack, but any rats that are there would be able to move toward maybe a target that is dealing the most damage or the most currently threatened or whatever. And then the last villain action that they would get is You Make Me Sick. And with this action, centered on the Piper, all creatures in a 20-foot sphere would make a DC 15 Constitution save against poison. So essentially they're emitting this sort of cloud of poison. And there are different effects if they fail the save versus if they succeed. But the other thing is all rats in this area get the diseased condition, which is an alternative for rats specifically, like for giant rats. And I included that in the stat blocks in the module. So I thought that this was kind of a good Nova ability for the Rat Piper that would make these final throws of combat feel a lot more engaging and fun. And I don't know, I thought it would be a good, like, kind of powerful note to end this little mini boss battle on. All right, so now we're back on the map, and that combat kind of goes back and forth, and then you have room 5. So this is a secret room. I wouldn't illustrate this to my players right off the bat, hence secret. Behind the throne, there is a small plaque on the wall, and there's a keyhole in that plaque. So you can find the key for this on the Piper themselves. Alternatively, if there's a rogue in the party, they could try to lockpick this. But if someone is searching the room after killing the Piper, they might notice grooves in the wall that indicate that there is a secret door there. That's something that I normally like to do to try to reward investigation checks, especially specific investigation checks. Like, I want to look at the walls to see if there's any loose bricks or anything, because players tend to kind of catch on, and I want to reward them when they're thinking creatively like that. If the players make it into the treasure room, then there's additional benefits for them there, right? So there might be specific, like a bunch of surplus cheese, maybe even the items that the innkeep, if you use that plot hook that the innkeep was looking for. There might be a hat of vermin from Xanathar's guide, and there could be a flute of vermin summoning. Now, the other option, obviously, is that flute could just be on the Piper themselves. However you want to handle that is up to you. But I wanted there to be, this could even just be a room where the warlocks keeps their actual valuables. So there could be gems and gold and maybe pieces of art. If this warlock was the former owner of this house, maybe there's like a love letter and remnants of their past self in this house. And that could even turn into something more complicated, right? How did they become this warlock? And it could start to spiral into a much larger campaign to figure out where this person got their powers, where they made a pact from, who they were tied to, things like that, right? So this is my second side quest for D&D 5th edition. If you end up using this, any of the parts, or even if you run the whole thing for your party, please let me know in the description. If you have any other ideas for like rooms or traps or anything that could get inserted into this, or how it could expand, please let me know. But as always, be safe. Make smart life choices.